guys have specific topics, I can do a quick recap of the lectures that we've given until now, the past 2 or 3, that had to do with the proofs of the existence of God. Or I do have a topic on the side that's kind of outside what we've covered. But the point of that little lecture that I've given over the years a couple of times, it's usually very well received, especially for people who are into research and academics and who have more of an intellectual approach to religion and to life in general, but religion specifically. So I thought I'd just do a quick summary of that point, and then you guys, depending on what your interest is, we can keep it very light and just discuss that or not, or we go back to, if you have any questions, concerns, clarifications about the last couple of lectures we've had, which is about the existence of God. So the topic itself is basically giving an overview of the Islamic sciences. This allows anyone to get a good appreciation of the different disciplines that we call Islamic sciences. So when someone talks about Islam, what are the big fields of study and kind of the big topics studied? So if you have a question, it would be good for you to know which field is studying it, what type of scholar is studying it. If you want to study Islam, it gives you a map of everything out there in a very systematic way. And so it's a lot easier for you to concentrate on one field as opposed to another. Because I think for a lot of people, it just looks like there's a lot and it's complicated and it's broad and it's deep and you don't know where to start and what to do with it. And it also, at the end of it, maybe we can talk a little bit about it. It also gives us an idea of how scientific knowledge or Islamic knowledge is actually built over time. And when you want to do research or when you want to see how a progress happens in a specific field, you understand that a lot more. Then I think a lot of people have this idea that everything is fixed, all the truths are known, nothing ever changes, and things are going to be like this, like the day they were revealed, and until the end of times, this is a static body of knowledge, and it's going to stay like that forever. So the big fields, when we say Islam, or when we say our religion, it branches into 2 big areas, 2 big domains. One of them is let's call it the more beliefs, theory and beliefs, and the other one is action. So let's start with the beliefs first, because that's what we've been talking about for the past couple of months here. So the beliefs are referred to as aqa'id or ilm al-kalam, is basically the field, the science that tries to identify the list of questions and topics and themes that have to do with what we have to believe in as Muslims. So anything that has to do with God and His existence and His attributes, such as divine justice, prophethood, the afterlife, topics like al-arsh, al-kursi, angels, all of that usually falls under beliefs. So this is what you're supposed to believe in. One side, one aspect of that science is for you as a Muslim. So it allows you to know what you're supposed to know and believe. Another aspect, of course, is the polemical one. So it's so that you assess and you're able to answer when questions or objections are coming from outside your faith, your belief system. And I think there's also today a huge need to continue to push the limits of that field, because every day there's new questions. And it's not that the questions are necessarily new, they're formulated in a new way. But someone who really studies this field in depth and you study its history, you see that today some of the things that are being said, they were said actually 1500 years ago. And it's the same question or the same topic or the same issue that was raised and was answered and it was dealt with, and no one raised it for 400 years in the Islamic world. And now suddenly it's springing up again as this big objection that no one knows what to do with. Actually, it was answered and there's huge books compiled about that and it was done with. So I think you get a huge advantage of that. And what we're doing in our lectures right now is to try to build that foundation, the belief system, the foundation of the belief system. What we're doing is a very beginner level, just to introduce the big topics, but I think it gives you a taste of where things can go. And it can get very, very sophisticated, very complex if we wanted to take it to advanced levels. So that's one field. On the other side, the other domain, as we said, the big domain is your action. So everything in Islam that falls under your beliefs is your aqa'id or ilm al-kalam, and we can talk at length about why it was called ilm al-kalam. And maybe we will in future lectures, because we're about to start, when we go back to the normal progression, we're about to start the attributes of God, and one of his attributes is kalam. Does God have speech or not? Does he speak? Does he communicate or not? And we can talk a little bit more on how this was dealt with in Islamic history, and the big controversies it caused, and the big schools of thought that came out of that. And one of the theories, one of the hypotheses about why the field of beliefs or aqa'id is called ilm al-kalam comes from that issue of kalamullah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is his kalam part of his essence, or is it an action? So is it created in time, or is he eternally a speaker or communicating? Anyways, so we'll talk about that when we get there. On the aspect of action, of human action, here we have everything that has to do with what you're supposed to do and what you ought to do or ought not to do as a Muslim. And this splits into two big fields in the Islamic world. So one of them is what everybody refers to as fiqh. Today it's called fiqh. And it was called by different names over times, but really it's the ahkam and ahkam amaliyah. So basically what you want is your practical verdict. And on the other side, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, under action, under your actions, you have your akhlaq or ethics. So both of those constitute the action field. So you have your belief system, and that's your aqa'id, and then you have your action system. And this is your Islamic laws. So what is the role of a scholar who specializes in fiqh or specializes in Islamic law? His role is to give you a verdict. The verdict falls in one of the 5 categories we have called ahkam, categories for every situation in life. So no matter what situation you could think of, it has to fall from a practical perspective, not a belief perspective. What you're supposed to do about it. So can you do it? Must you do it? It falls under one of 5 cases. So either you have to do it, it's prescribed, it's wajib. Either you have to avoid it, it becomes haram. Either you have it's completely neutral, so you have full free choice to do it or not to do it, up to you completely, and that's mubah, completely neutral, indifferent. You have, it's recommended to do it, that's your mustahab, and it's recommended not to do it, and that's your makruh. The job, the function, the role of the faqih is to identify which one of these ahkam.
What was it, the third one?
Mubah, so basically neutral, indifferent. I don't know, you say, I'd like to drink some water right now. Yeah, you can. It's not wajib, it's not haram, it's not makruh, it's completely indifferent. You want to do something, and there's no verdict about it, it doesn't change anything, you're free to do it. And yeah, we'll leave it at that for now. There's a way to look at things that you always push them out of the indifferent to one side or the other. Okay, so depending on what your intention is, your deeper intention, drinking water can become, or depending on the circumstances around it, drinking water in a normal case, for a normal person, it should be indifferent, neutral. It could become recommended. It could become not recommended or recommended not to do it. It could become wajib. You have to do it. So for instance, I don't know, there's a child beside you and you know that they're a lot thirstier than you are. It might become makruh for you to drink that water. It's better for you not to drink and to let them drink it. Okay? Or in this case, you want to drink the water because it's going to give you more energy to go do more worship. Okay, so that becomes recommended. If you don't drink this water right now in the middle of the desert and you find the water and you don't drink it, you're going to die, it becomes wajib. Okay? Or you drink the water and you're sure that, it has it's impure, it has najasa in it. Okay, so everything, it's not as black and white, and the more you study, the more you see these, but generally speaking, drinking water on its own would be indifferent, neutral. When the faqih, when the scholar of Islamic law starts to study each one of these questions they have, so let's say they study, I don't know, something about Sawm, about fasting. How do they determine where it falls under in these? So basically there are two big ways. The easier way, it's not easy, it's easier. The easier way is when they have an actual direct proof. So the issue is actually mentioned explicitly, directly, either in the Holy Quran or in the Sunnah of the Prophet. So he has a hadith that says this is haram, this is halal, this is mubah. Probably not one hadith, probably he has 40 of them. This is where his job begins, and he has to go through them and decide, especially if they're contradictory. How does he give preponderance and priority of one over the other and all of that? Okay, that's one type. When the faqih, when the scholar of Islamic law doesn't have this, when he doesn't have something direct from the Holy Quran or the Sunnah saying this is the hukum, what does he do? Here he has to fall back on general principles, again, that he doesn't create. General principles also from the Holy Quran and the Sunnah that allow him to apply to situations where there is no direct, explicit proof telling you what the verdict is. Okay? So these are called usul amaliyah. So based on his application of the general principles, he can still make it fall under one of these 5 ahkam, when there is no direct proof. And this happens a lot, especially for things that are new to the world. Let's say, am I allowed to use a cell phone? Well, I'm sure there's no ayah and there's no riwayah that talks about cell phones. So what the faqih is going to do, he's going to apply a general principle that he has to the use of cell phones. Because cell phones are a new phenomena in the world. But if I say I want to ride a horse, there's probably something in the Quran or the Sunnah that talks about horses, and that will be a lot more explicit. Right? Because it's not a new reality in the world. It's not a new phenomena. Okay, so when the faqih started, when the people who specialized in Islamic law started doing their work, one example, they go into a field, a topic, and they're trying to find the verdict. The first thing they notice is that for the first question, they have 20 narrations, 20 reports from the Holy Prophet or Ahlul Bayt about this topic. Good, I have something to work with. Second topic, he only has one. He only has one person who lived, one companion of the infallibles, of the Imams or the Holy Prophet, who reports one narration that has reached the scholar. Okay, so before I go into the actual answer, I have to research this question, this general question. When I only have a single narrator reporting a narration, am I allowed to rely on that or not? Right? I only have one. Is it trustworthy? I'm being told this person is solid, he doesn't forget, he doesn't lie. The person himself is trustworthy. And we'll talk about that in a second, what field studies that. But let's say the person is trustworthy, but it still generates questions. How come I only have one person in the entire life of the Imams talking about this topic, which should have probably been talked about a lot more? I only have one narration from one person? What's the issue? So can I really rely on this or not? Okay, so I'm not going to say yes or no. That's a huge topic and they study it for years. The point I'm trying to make is he started thinking about this question because he's trying to answer another question. But he ran into this type of situation, right? He ran into a situation where the proof he needs for his answer happens to be of this type, which is one narration from one narrator. So he has now to spend time dealing with this and finding an answer to this question first before he can apply it, right? Otherwise, I don't know if I can rely on it first. Before I even see what the ruwaya, what the narration says, maybe the narration says it's haram or it's halal, am I even allowed to rely on it? Let's say I research this to death, and I come up with my conclusion about it. I write it all up so that I don't forget, and I can pass it on to others. Okay, I move to the third issue. The third issue is the same as the second one. I again have only one narrator with one narration. Do I redo my entire research, or can I rely on it? I can rely on it. Now I created a principle that I can now apply to every situation where I only have one narrator with one narration. Because I did the research once. I'm not going to do it again every time I encounter this. And the reality is, this research is outside of the actual verdict. But this research is still required. It's necessary to do it before I can rely on it, right? Okay. There are literally dozens of these situations. This is an actual situation that I described. It's called Hujjiyat Khabar al-Wahid. Okay? To what extent you're allowed to rely on a report coming from a single narrator. Okay? This is a topic, and it's studied for a few months if you study usul. These situations where you have to research a principle on its own before you can rely on the proofs, all of these have been taken out of the field called Islamic law, fiqh. They've been taken out with time because you're spending too much time on these and not on the actual studying the verdict. So they took them out and they put them in another field. That field only studies these universal principles that are always, you're going to have to keep them in your pocket. Whenever you run into a different proof, you have to know which one to use. So they put those in another field called usul al-fiqh. So if you hear usul al-fiqh, not usul al-din, because usul al-din is another name for aqa'id, another name for the belief system. Usul al-fiqh, the principles of fiqh, now I think it makes sense why they're called the principles of fiqh, because they took out everything that's common to all of fiqh in a field, and they called that field usul al-fiqh. Okay? So those two go together. Fiqh and usul al-fiqh. It doesn't make sense, now that you understand how they work together, it doesn't make sense to study one without the other. The principles are useless on their own. They give you the tools to apply to the actual proofs to find the verdict. And studying the verdicts on their own, it's like you're missing the universal principles you need. Okay? So you need both of them. So a faqih is someone who spends most of their time on this field. Okay? When they say someone is an ayatullah or a mujtahid or a marji' or he's written a risala, the book of the laws, everything is here, what I just described. Okay? That's the field. Let's keep going now. We said the domain of action is split into two big pieces, two big parts, two big sciences. So one of them is Islamic law and the principles of law. That's one half. The other half is akhlaq. So what's the purpose of akhlaq? The field of akhlaq, again, it has to do with your actions. But this one, while the first one was a lot more about the legal aspect, the legality of what you're doing, this one has to do with spirituality. So this is how do you purify yourself. So in akhlaq, you study two things. You study the human soul and its different faculties, because you want to understand how you can control yourself in a disciplined manner. You understand all the different faculties. The faculties of the soul are like, let's say when you look at a human being physically and you say they have arms, they have legs, they don't perform the same function. You have eyes, you have ears, they don't perform the same functions. They're all different faculties. The soul is the same thing. It has different faculties. The point of akhlaq first is to teach you about these faculties and how do you use them in a balanced way. That's one. And then two, it talks about general things, actions, because we're in an action world. All of this is not for itself. That's the theory part of akhlaq. Understanding how your soul works. And the other aspect is the actions. So what kind of actions? Actions that are for your soul and actions that are for your body. For example, for your soul, you may research the topic of hypocrisy and sincerity in action. Okay, that's an ethical topic. You study that in ethics. To what extent do I have to make my action really sincere so that it's for God, and it's not so that people notice that I did something good? Okay, so this is not necessarily, it may have a physical aspect, but a lot more for my soul. The intent of the action. It is an action, but the action is really happening internally, not externally. When I make an act of charity, what does it do to me? What does it mean? You spend time thinking about that. Topics like sadaqah, for instance, charity, or ujub, or arrogance, or transgression, and what does it mean? What are the effects of those on a human heart? And what do you do to clean it after this happens to it? Okay, so this is the whole topic of ethics, spirituality, morals in Islam. That's akhlaq. With this, we kind of covered the big fields. Okay, these are the big fields in Islam. Running through all of this, we mentioned two things now. Those two things have become their own fields as well with time. In order to do anything that has to do with beliefs or that has to do with actions, I have to rely on the main sources of Islamic knowledge, which are what? Which are two. The Holy Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, and as Shia we believe in the Sunnah of the Imams. Okay, so not only the Prophet, but the 12 Imams as well. This generated new fields of study. But those fields, the practical repercussions of them, we notice them in the fields we just talked about. Okay? But in order to reach any conclusions there, you need these specializations. So, first of all, specializations or fields related to the Holy Quran. And the second one, fields and specializations related to the hadith, the narrations. Before I talk about those two, there are fields that are secondary to those. They're tools. It's like they give you a toolkit and they tell you, as you're going to start specializing in these, I'm also going to give you a few tools. Those fields, you don't study them for themselves. They don't have any specifics. There's nothing special about them in themselves. But if you don't have them, you're not going to be able to really go quickly through the other fields. Those fields, for instance, are logic. Because logic teaches you how to think without making mistakes, and to notice quickly if there are mistakes being made when others are thinking, or talking, or writing. Okay? Today, for those of you who go to college or university, they don't always call it logic, they call it critical thinking. Okay, but unfortunately they never give any context when you take those courses. They just teach you the symbols and what it means if you put these two together and those two together, but you don't understand the bigger context. Well, why are we studying this? What do you do with it? Well, you're supposed to apply this to any argument you encounter in your life. And you look at it critically. Critically means you want to see, you don't take it as is. You have to be able to be critical about it. To say, is it valid or is it a fallacy? Is there a mistake? Is there a dupery? Are you trying to trick me in the way you're using the language or using the argument or? So that's logic. Okay, so that's one field. Another field, all the sciences related to language, especially Arabic. The Holy Quran and the Sunnah are all in Arabic. So if you don't spend time studying the 3 to 5 big fields in Arabic, you're going to have trouble really advancing in the Islamic sciences. That's a second field. Do you study it for its own sake? No. It's a tool that you're going to need. Another tool that you're going to need, history. If you don't understand history, you're going to have trouble putting things in context. When the verse of the Holy Quran comes down, and you're trying to understand it, you need to understand what was going on at that time. What were the events surrounding that? This is not something you can always find in the Holy Quran. You may have a little verse that seems to be talking about something, an event, but the event is not there in the Holy Quran. So where do you find it? You're going to find it in history. And then when you dig, you see that, oh my God, this is an event that lasted 2 months and it involved the entire Muslim community and it had huge repercussions. The Holy Quran only has one line about it, and it gives a verdict, or it gives a the summary, the outcome, something practical about it. But how do I know if I can apply this to my life? I need to understand the context, the historical context. So that's another field. And maybe, Irfan, I won't talk about it right away. In history, if we're specifically studying the history of people, in English usually we refer to that as biography, because now you're not looking at events, you're looking at people. In Arabic, this is usually called seerah. Technically, if you want to use it in a very restrictive sense, seerah or ilm al-seerah or fiqh al-seerah is usually about the life of the Holy Prophet and the Imams. But sometimes this is used in a larger context and it can apply to anyone. Their companions and all the big figures of Islam can fall into that. So if you're specifically looking only at the human being, when they were born, what happened in their life, when they died, all of that, that's more seerah. If you're looking more at the events or everything together, that's more tarikh or history. Okay. Now let's go back to the Holy Quran and the narrations. So now we know what the big tools are. Okay, after the tools, now we look at the actual topic, the field itself. The field itself is what? The Holy Quran has 3 big sciences. The first one, easy. The first one are all the sciences that have to do with the actual recitation of the Holy Quran. Okay, so they teach you how to recite it properly. That's one field. We won't spend more time on that. The second one, the most popular, the one that comes to mind the first about the Holy Quran, is tafsir, exegesis, which basically means in Arabic, tafsir is when you remove a veil hiding something. When you remove it, salam alaikum wa rahmatullah. Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Allah khalid. Okay, so basically tafsir is what? Tafsir is when you remove the outer layer off of something and you see behind it. You see what was hidden behind it. That's tafsir. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to remove the words to go to the meaning. Okay? Third field. There's a whole lot of topics, subjects, that have to do with the Holy Quran, but you're not studying them when you're studying the recitation, the reading of the Quran, and they're not actually about the tafsir. They're not about the verses. So for instance, we have scholars who tell us there are verses in the Quran that give you Allah. And then other verses that seem to, the technical term is abrogate. They seem to remove or cancel that law. Okay, so that's a topic. If I don't find a conclusion, if I don't research that topic on its own, are there laws that were abrogated? I have to find an answer to that question first. Before I go to a verse and say, is this law applicable or not applicable? I have to see, is there even abrogation in Islam? Is it true that there are laws that were valid at some point, and then during the life of the Prophet, in the Quran it says, this law is no longer applicable? Do we have laws like this or not? Okay, that's one example. Another example, what is revelation? When we say the Quran was revealed to the Prophet, what does it mean? What's revelation? What's the nature of this communication? Is it like the meaning is in the heart and the mind of the Prophet, and the Prophet can just put words to it and say it in his own words to the people? Or are the words themselves revealed to him? So can I play around with the words or not? For instance. Okay, topics like these, they're not actually tafsir, right? So when I read the Quran and I'm trying to understand what it means, I don't encounter these topics. But these are questions and topics about the Quran. All of these, again, were taken out and put in another field called qur'anic sciences. So ulum al-Quran is the other field that runs in parallel with tafsir. Okay, so those are the 3 qur'anic sciences. And we'll finish with the last one, which is the sciences related to hadith, narrations, the reports that we have. Okay, so what fields are those? 2 big ones. The first one is when you actually look at the narration itself. Okay, so and so reported from so and so that the Prophet did this. The Prophet said that. Okay, so what are we looking for? We're looking for sayings of the Prophet, doings of the Prophet and the Imams, or actions. non-actions and actions, which are called usually decisions. So he decided not to do anything. He saw someone, example, he saw one of his companions walk in the market, go to a Christian and buy cheese from him and eat it. And the Imam didn't say anything. That's what the narration says. Is this relevant or not? We don't have any saying, we don't have any doing, the Imam didn't do anything. That's what the narration says. One of the companions of the Imam walked in the market, went to a Christian seller who's selling cheese. He bought the cheese and he ate it, and the Imam saw him and didn't do anything. So when we say sunnah, the sunnah is what? The tradition is what? Everything they do, everything they say, and all their decisions. This is hugely relevant for me. Because now I know if there was a problem with what his companion was doing, the Imam would have said something. That's his duty. As an Imam, that's his duty. He's not like me. I can decide to say something or not. I may be lazy or not. His duty is to deal with these things so that people learn everything. So if the Imam is not doing or saying anything about it and the person can buy the cheese, that's it. I now have a ruling that it's okay to go buy food, this type of food, from the Christian and eat it, and there's no issue with it. So I can apply it to, go back to the Islamic law and apply it, right? Okay. So that's one thing. So in hadith, that's what I'm studying. I'm actually studying the content of the hadith, and I'm looking for those three things. The saying, the doing, the decisions. The problem is, we're living 14 centuries after the Prophet. So everything that's reported to us has gone through a lot of people. I need to study those people to understand, are they trustworthy? And bring them all the way back in a clear chain, without any gaps, all the way to the Imam or to the Prophet, so that I can say reliably that they actually did this or they actually said this. If there are gaps, I can't rely on it. Now there are gaps. Who knows what happened during that gap? Who knows what happened during that 30-year thing? Maybe there was no hadith. Someone just made it up during that time. And that's why I have a chain from that point on. But there's a missing link. If you were a student in this field and you had a teacher who told you this narration, why is his name not mentioned? Why are you not telling me where you got this from? Okay? So this field that studies the trustworthiness of the people reporting it, this is called ilm al-rijal. You're studying how good of a memorizer were they? Did they make a lot of mistakes? We have people who were amazing, and they would remember everything, and 10 years later they would still remember it. And others, they're said, no, they made a lot of mistakes. Kana kathirun nisyan. He was very forgetful. Okay, which tells us what? Which tells us we can rely on him when he's reading. He studied it. He was good as a student when he studied, he got them. He wrote it all down. But when he reports it out of memory, he makes mistakes. So when he is reporting something, I need to know, was it in writing or is it in person memorized? If it's memorized, I probably can't rely on the words. Yeah.
Why were they relying a lot on memorization instead of writing stuff down? I know it's supposed to have to write things down. No?
Okay, so actually, there's a political dimension to this question. Okay, in very short, there was a movement right after the death of the Holy Prophet to prohibit people from writing anything. The excuse that was given is that they don't want the ahadith to get mixed up with the Quran, which is a really bad excuse. But that's what was said, okay? The real reason is those who were in the political power were afraid of what people will find in the ahadith that contradicts their actions. So they said no more hadith. And so the hadith really started being written again formally about 150 years later. In the Sunnah world.
I know why that happened, but why didn't they start writing during Imam Ali's time and past, or like they start writing along like 150 years later?
Yeah, so 150 years later, you're past Imam al-Sadiq.
Yeah. So like, why didn't they start Imam Ali?
Because they were not allowed to.
Like Umar's ruling was still valid?
And Uthman and the Umayyin. This is a big topic. The writing of the hadith needs to be studied on its own. How, at the time of Muawiyah, what the Umayyin did, what their policy was to turn the hadith for themselves. So the political strategy that was used was that we are going to designate a couple of people in the entire ummah, and those are going to be the only people allowed to, no, not right, allowed to say anything on behalf of the Prophet. And so in the time of Muawiyah, for instance, one of those people, one of the 6 or 4 at that time, was Abu Hurairah. And that's why today when you compare the life of Abu Hurairah with a lot of other companions who lived much longer with the Prophet than the 6 months that Abu Hurairah lived with the Prophet, you see it doesn't make sense. He's reporting 6,000 or more narrations and they're reporting 30. What happened? They lived with the Prophet for 20 years or 10 years and he lived with him 6 months. And we have 6,000 narrations from him. And we have 30 from that companion. Why? If you don't understand what happened politically, you're not going to understand why it is this way. Right? So there are people who are being appointed. You're allowed to speak, so yeah, people can sit and write down what you're saying. But if you're not allowed to say anything, hello, you sit in your home and you don't say anything because you're going to get punished, tortured, exiled, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
So do we not trust Abu Hurairah then?
Yeah, we have an issue with Abu Hurairah. Yeah.
Because I saw a quote by him and I sent it to Muhammad. He said, I don't know if it's true or not. It just seems dumb. It's like he said the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "If do not drink water standing up, and if you do, you must vomit it." And I was like, how does that? Why?
Okay, so there's 2 things.
I mean, it makes sense to drink. It's supposed to have to drink while sitting down, but
yeah.
Then I have to vomit. He's like, you must vomit. I was like,
yeah. So the must, and this is where the faqih, the specialist, has to come in and tell you what is the must here. Okay, that's first one. There's a few points. So is this the must that is must as in if you don't do it you go to hell? It's haram. Is it the same must as you must pray and you must fast and if you don't it's haram? Or is it the must that is it's recommended to? Okay, so that's up to the faqih to tell you. That's why we said it's his job to tell you in which one of the 5 verdicts it falls. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is, that's a general remark, if I don't understand it doesn't mean it's stupid. Okay, so maybe there is something that we don't know about it. Maybe there is a secret that in 500 years or 50 years or someone somewhere, maybe not you, but someone somewhere has already actually discovered it. Why it is that we have narrations that say when you drink water, drink it standing. Or we have another one, and this one's from our imams, that says drink it while standing during the day.
You mean sitting?
And sitting during the night. Okay? I'm not saying it's valid or not. That's another topic that needs to be discussed as a.
But they don't tell you to vomit.
Okay, the hadith that I know is doesn't say vomit, but he's saying basically the hadith may be saying there's an issue with it. It can cause harm. And those ahadith actually say it causes a physical harm to your body. Because of your position and because of. Is it really about day and night? Probably not. It's probably more, generally speaking, people are up, awake, energetic, doing work, moving around during the day, and the body reacts to water, maybe it's cold water, I don't know, differently than if you're, let's say, lying down at rest. The body takes the water differently. I don't know. Okay, someone needs to research that, and as I said, maybe some people have. Okay, and we can do a whole topic about that one. The point is, if I don't understand it, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's stupid.
Might be correct,
yeah. Now, the last point, Abu Hurairah, generally speaking, yeah, that would fall under, like we would have to have a lecture or lectures about his life. Who says that he's trustworthy and who says that he's not? How have scholars actually dealt with his ahadith? Generally speaking, since the time he's been reporting his ahadith till now. At the beginning, when he first came and he would do certain things, one of the first things that Umar ibn al-Khattab, while he was Khalifa, he beat him up. He had him brought, he beat him once himself with his durra. The durra is a piece of metal that had jewels on it that he carried with himself, with him all the time. And he beat him on his head with it until he bled, because he had heard that he was lying in one instance. Okay? In another instance, he kind of wanted not to give the entire money. He was sent to gather charity from a town or towns. And when he came back, apparently he didn't give back everything that he was supposed to. And he was beaten up and punished for that. Okay? This is when you study his life. So if we want to, this becomes a rajali bahth, right? So we have to spend time understanding who he is, the role he played, and then you can go to his narrations. Okay, so now what do I do when I encounter a narration from Abu Hurairah? Does it mean I rejected Abu Hurairah automatically? Or maybe do I say, okay, let's park it and see if I have something else from someone maybe more trustworthy that I can rely on, and compare them, and I can tell what I can trust and what I can't trust, for instance. Okay, so that becomes a whole topic. It's a good question. Anyway, so that's, in hadith, these are the two big fields. You have the right al-hadith, or the narrations and the contents of the narrations themselves, and then you have the chain of people who have narrated it to you. Generally speaking, when you look at all of these, first of all, you get the mapping. So you understand the big fields, the big sciences in Islam, and what kind of work is being done in each science. That's first. Secondly, you have to keep in mind that just like many of you have studied in school and university and college, in every field there are different schools of thought. There's different scholars, they disagree, some of them follow different rules and different tools and different theories, and they come up with new ones. Everything that you know about your fields in science and economics and sociology and history applies to these fields as well. So you're going to have different scholars with different schools of thought, with different tools, with different principles, and these are going to give you slight variations. Two people can look at the verse, but the way they apply the principles of tafsir is going to be different. You're going to have different schools of thought. I remember a few years ago I was asked to give a lecture on leadership in Islam. And at the end of the lecture, and the lecture was mostly, the majority of the people sitting there were actually PhDs. Okay, people who had graduated with a PhD or people who were finishing a PhD. So they're looking at everything in a very scholarly way, okay, very academic way. And at the end of the lecture, I said this topic of leadership has not really been researched a lot. So this is a topic that requires a lot more research, especially in this world, in this age, where this is becoming a more important topic. And we have a lot more people in leadership positions, and they need to know what are the big principles they need to use to say, my style of leadership is Islamic or not Islamic. Okay? The lecture ended with something like that. And I had a lot of them come after and say, this was the first time that they realized that the Islamic fields are just like the fields they're studying. A lot of them were engineering or science. And they were saying, just like their fields, they progress, they evolve. There are fields that are there are gaps. You know, sometimes if you look at a bibliography in a field, you can see that there's maybe 400 studies on this topic, and there's 4 studies on that one. So you know there's a gap there. There's a lot more work that needs to be done before scientists have a better picture about this. Well, the same thing in Islamic fields. There are gaps. There are areas that have been researched to death. If someone now comes and talks about one of these, people are going to laugh at them and tell them, go back to school and just study. There's hundreds of volumes written about this topic. Let's say Tahara. And someone wants to write a book and say, I'm going to reform Islam and I'm going to change the rules of Tahara. I'm like, okay, there's literally thousands of volumes written. And the work is still ongoing. So before, you say that you're the one who split the atom and changed the world, what have you actually studied? Because there's a mountain of literature already in place. But if you say I'm going to work on a field, let's say like leadership, the modern notion of leadership. Oh, okay, there's probably 4 or 5 books here, 4 or 5 books there. So all of it together, there's really not that much. So let's see what you have. It's easier to pierce through and to contribute something new because there's less already out there. Anyways, so that was the discussion. That was the topic that I wanted to open up for discussion. And then obviously we can go back to the past couple of lectures. So as a quick reminder, we talked about the two of the biggest proofs for the existence of God. One of them has to do with what we call the design of the world, the order of the world, the regularity of the world. And that tells us not only that God exists, but that he has some of his attributes. So he must have power, he must have knowledge, he must have wisdom to create this kind of world. That's one. And the second one is the one that we called contingency and necessity. We said if everything in the world is only possible, and we cannot, if every time you touch something possible, it requires something else that is only possible for it to exist, this is going to create an infinite regress. You're going to have to go back infinitely. And if you go back infinitely, you never end up with something now. And we gave enough examples that I think it became clear enough. Okay, so those were the two big proofs that we presented until now for the existence of God. And we said the next topics, inshallah, are going to have to do with the attributes. So we're going to say, what kind of God are we talking about? Now that we know there is something called God, what kind of God are we talking about? And of course, it has to be the same logic that we used until now. We follow the same logical way. Anyways, that was the